Smile, Please by Raymond Williams. The chipped cane chair creaked its protest as Delarice plonked herself upon it to gaze at her reflection in the large mirror. The bright arc of naked electric bulbs around her reflection gave her a pasty white hue. She bent her head forward a little to study her dry, yellow hair in the glare of the light. It was time for another rinse, really, because here and there the darker roots were quite conspicuous. Still, it would do for tonight, for thanks to the red spotlights, which bathed her on stage, the audience would never notice. But come to that, the clientele one encountered at the El Toro Club were amazingly tolerant of such things. As long as their very own delectable Delarice continued to sway and gyrate in front of them, they would be happy, providing, of course, she continued to carelessly lose one scanty article of clothing after another to the steady thumping of the tom-toms. In fact, they may even be tolerant enough to forgive the lack of music altogether. Noise does tend to distract one's concentration at times, and during Dell's act, one needed peace to concentrate in earnest. God, what a life! She sighed in unison with the lips of her reflection. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the biggest sucker of all? She closed her eyes and covered her face with her long fingers. In the past, each performance had been easier than the one before, but now it was getting harder. Before she went on each night, she kept getting these frightening moods of depression. She was already 34, which was far too old for this game, but what alternative was there? An escape into the business to which many of her friends had already turned. Was supplying instant sex to frustrated, paying clients a better proposition than this? True, the money could be better, but her gin bills were already high enough, and the change to prostitution would hardly bring them down. She had tried to save as much as she could over the years, but like the others in her profession, she enjoyed living it up. What she needed was some kind of sugar daddy to come along and give her a few thousand, so that she could pack the business in here and now and fade away into a plush, comfortable home far from the dazzling spotlight. But she had given up believing in Father Christmas at a very early age. 2 sharp raps on her dressing room door startled her back to the present. The eunuch-like voice of Ted the callboy squeaked through a 2 minutes to the off, Miss Delarice. She squeezed a sick grimace at the mirror as his chuckle floated away down the passageway. Dirty pig. He was all eyes and grubby little fingers whenever you passed him in the corridor. One of these days she'd... Oh, what was the use in getting herself in a state? He just wasn't worth the bother. Anyway, she needed all her strength for the act. Ah well, once more into the breach, and all that sort of thing. She pulled open the drawer and took out the ever-ready gin bottle. She hastily half-filled her blue plastic mug and greedily gulped the cold bitter liquid. The bottle glugged again as she replenished her empty mug. A drop of mother's ruin always seemed to do the trick. The only snag was the quantity needed each time seemed to increase. Still, as she wasn't a mother, there was no harm, was there? She could feel her circulation stirring into life as she returned the bottle to the drawer. A quick check in the mirror on her red and black lace costume, and she was on her way. She hurried down the draughty corridor, clutching her dark blue velvet robe tightly around her. As she got to the wings, Fat Max, El Toro's resident comedian, compere and part-time barman, was just winding up his act. During the splatter of applause, his little round eyes rolled quickly on his red, wet face towards her. Seeing her ready and waiting, he held up one hand to stem the noise of the lone clapper and continued. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the girl you've all been waiting to see, and believe me, there's a lot to see. He chuckled thickly into the microphone, but stopped abruptly when a plaintive voice cried out, Stop yapping, fatso, and get on with it. Max's grin hardened for a second, but with the proficiency that comes with experience, he continued as if he had not been interrupted. Here she is. "Where? I can't see her," came another voice from the gloom amid a burst of laughter. "Your very own," continued Max. "Delectable, de-lovely, developed, Delarice." There was a click as the tape recorder started up, then the club was filled with the steady throb of muffled tom-toms. The smiling mask disintegrated from Max's face as he reached Delarice in the wings. "Good luck, Del, old girl. There's a few bloody-minded bums out there tonight. You're welcome to them. God, do I need a drink." Delarice steadied herself against a pillar for an instant, as if hoping for some strength to ooze from the cold stone to help her into the spotlight. Max wasn't the only person who needed a drink. She cursed herself for not absorbing more gin before leaving the dressing room. Just another half mugful would have made all the difference. "Go on, Del, they're all waiting," hissed a voice from behind her. The next moment she felt herself stalking seductively into the shimmering pool of pink light. Instantly cheers and a few whistles hurtled out of the black abyss towards her, but fortunately all she could see were the two pink suns glaring their rays directly at her. Clicking one of her stiletto heels in time with the beat, she drew open the neck cord of her blue robe, then suddenly with the deft touch of a true matador, she whirled the robe free of her body around her head a few times before leaving it to flutter to the ground between herself and the exit from the stage. She knew without looking that it was perfectly in position for her to snatch up to cover her nakedness at the end of the act. A single wolf whistle just managed to pierce the drone of the music. But Delarice was immune to noisy distractions. She proceeded to turn and sway, forcing her close-fitting costume taut over whichever curve of her body was visible to the crowd. Then at the desired moment she turned her back on the inquisitive eyes and proceeded to play with the zip on the back of her costume. The zip had been gently lowered to halfway when the voice from the wilderness called, "Unzip a banana!" And a blast of coarse laughter dimmed the tom-toms for a moment. Completely unperturbed, Del slid the zip to the small of her back, and after turning to face the two pink eyes again, wriggled tantalizingly free of her costume. Cheers and calls flooded the club as she kicked herself free and waved her arms high above her head. Her tight silver bra and briefs glinted as they reflected the light. Even the thick curtain of blue smoke seemed to be curling slower in the shafts of pinkness, as if it was aware that the best was to appear at any moment. Apart from the drum, there was now an expectant hush lying heavily in the atmosphere. Delarice could sense the sea of blinkless eyes focused on her as she slowly slipped the metal clasp of her bra behind her back. Still swaying her hips rhythmically, she crossed her arms across her chest and firmly taking a shoulder strap in each hand, she eased the silver covering slowly towards the audience. Then, just as they were beginning to glimpse the rounded sides of her breasts, she suddenly flicked the bra high into the air, giving a well-timed skip forward herself so that her breasts quivered violently up and down. The effect on the audience was shattering. Screams of delight mingling with cries of admiration thundered through the music. Del completed the climax of her act by twitching her tinted body in a wild frantic dance towards the side of the stage. Then with a quick swoop, she snatched up her robe and, amid desperate cries of despair, vanished into the wings. "Smashing performance, Del," said Max, giving her bottom a friendly pat as he passed her to get the rest of her clothes from the stage. Still panting from the effort she had put into her appearance, she put her robe over her shoulders and waited for the rest of her things. "Thank God that's another one over," she thought. "Here we are, Del," said Max, returning her crumpled clothes. She smiled her gratitude and clip-clopped happily back to her dressing room. For a while she just sat there exhausted, taking an occasional sip from her blue mug. Oh, it was a wonderful feeling when it was all over. She could feel all the tenseness and strain leaving her body. She sighed contentedly and stretched back in her creaking chair. In a little while she'd summon up enough energy to get dressed and go home, but not just yet. It was just as she was putting down her mug after draining the last few drops that she saw it. There in the middle of her dressing table was a neat brown paper parcel with "To Delarice" printed clearly on it. She was surprised that she hadn't seen it as soon as she'd come in. It had been left as conspicuously as possible. Still, in her hurry to get the bottle out, it was understandable, really. She picked it up curiously and turned it over a few times to see if there was anything else written on it. But, apart from "To Delarice," the paper was unmarked. She dug her long silver nails into the sellotape and ripped away the covering. Her eyes widened and her mouth opened at the sight. Held tightly by a thick red elastic band was a pile of new crisp £5 notes with a neatly typed yellow card on top. Her brain struggled to contend with the increased thumping of blood through her temples as she focused her eyes onto the print. It simply said, "Please find enclosed 100 £5 notes, which I trust will be sufficient recompense for awaiting a telephone call from me at 10:30 p.m. tonight." The card was unsigned. £500 from someone just for waiting for a telephone call. This was ridiculous. She ran a finger down the edge of the notes. Well, they all looked real enough to her, so if it was some kind of joke, she didn't mind in the least if it was worth £500. She picked up the brown paper and checked her name yet again. Yes, it was clearly addressed to her, and she was the only Delarice at the El Toro Club, so unless it had been delivered to the wrong place, then the money just had to be hers. All 500 of it. For her, just if she waited for a telephone call. There must be a catch somewhere, she thought, but where? That was the question. 10:30 tonight, that meant in about... She looked at her dusty travelling clock. Hell, it's nearly 10:30 now, she gasped. She pulled the card free of the elastic band, bundled the notes and paper into her handbag, and dashed to the door. The cold air in the corridor reminded her to pull her robe together to cover her exposed front as she rushed to the little office at the end. She burst in, half expecting to hear the phone ringing, but all was quiet. The only noise in the room came from Ted, who was sitting behind the desk, scrunching his way through an apple. "Has the phone been ringing, Ted?" she asked anxiously. Ted sucked some crushed apple to one side of his mouth and said, "Not since I've been in." Dell looked up at the wall clock. It was 10:29. Ted was eyeing her curiously. "Expecting a call, eh?" "Mind your own business," she answered curtly. "Sorry I spoke, I'm sure," said Ted, obviously hurt by the rebuff. "I thought you was good tonight, Miss Delarice," said Ted, curling his lips back to smile at her. "You've got bits of green apple peel stuck to your teeth," she cut back. Ted half turned his face away from her while he stuck a grubby finger into his mouth and swivelled it to and fro like a toothbrush. Dell was too busy watching the big hand of the clock creep slowly towards 10:30. Ted wiped his slimy finger on his sleeve, then edged his hand slowly towards a gap in Dell's robe, which his sly eyes had been surveying ever since she came into the room. He thrust his hand into the gap and fumbled his fingers around as much of her breast as he could grip before the smack to his side of his head sent him reeling back into his chair. No sooner had he landed than Dell sent his head reeling in the other direction with a blow from her left hand, then her right crashed in again. By now he had a hand over each side of his face for protection, while Dell continued to stand over him, swiping one way then the other. At first Ted whimpered and squealed as she lashed him, but then for no apparent reason he began to gurgle out little grunts and sighs of ecstasy. By this time Dell was beginning to run out of steam, and her hands were getting sore, but determination enabled her to go on with the treatment until she realised that Ted's eyes looked as big as the glass eyes in Madame Tussauds. She followed his gaze and saw that with the effort of striking him, her robe had been hanging open, and Ted had had a grandstand view of her bare breasts all the time, which explained everything. She quickly covered herself again, but the pause was long enough to allow Ted to scuttle out of the chair to the door. "I thought you was good on stage, Miss Delarice, but I'd never thought I'd get my own private performance. Why, I'd go through..." Before he could finish, it was time for him to beat a hasty retreat before the flying wire basket crashed against the door post where he had been standing. The clang of the basket hitting the floor was augmented by the sudden shrill of the telephone bell. Dell's pulse was already racing after her encounter with Ted. Her whole body felt hot and clammy, but she felt in no mood to answer a mystery telephone call. But prominent in her mind was a crisp bundle of blue notes, which was sufficient motivation for her to tolerate her damp skin and shaking nerves and lift the black greasy finger-printed receiver. A series of pips were torpedoed into her ear before a metallic crack ended them as abruptly as they had begun. Well, whoever was calling was using a call box, she thought. Not that that discovery was much help. "Hello?" she cooed expectantly. "Miss Kane?" inquired the voice. "Yes, that's right. I'm Delores Kane." "Ah, then good evening, Miss Kane," continued the well-spoken voice, sounded far more confident now that the identification had been completed to his satisfaction. "First of all, may I thank you for awaiting my call. I gather you received my message." "Well, yes, I did, but I don't know." Dell's hesitancy was interrupted. "All in good time, Miss Kane. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Edward." "Oh, hello, Edward," said Dell, completely baffled by it all. Edward what?" she inquired. "Just Edward," chuckled the voice. "Oh, I see," replied Dell, realizing that her best plan was to say as little as possible and allow the voice to get on with it. "I have been a great admirer of your art for some time now, Miss Kane." Oh, so that was the game, Dell thought to herself. Another dirty old man who wanted a private showing and anything else he could get. So that's what the money was, just a big fat carrot to get her to play around at any kinky game he had lined up for her back at his penthouse flat, probably. "Now look here," she burst in suddenly. "I don't mind you window shopping, Mr. Edward, whatever your name is, but there's no free samples going on, so you can—" "My dear Miss Kane," came the wounded reply, "pray allow me to assure you such a proposition had never crossed my mind. I deeply regret that you have so hastily thought of me as a person who would dare to make such suggestions to a talented artist as yourself. I fear you have completely misconstrued my small gift of money." Small gift, £500. Dell was numbed at the thought. He just couldn't be for real. He must have taken her silence as a vote of confidence, because he continued, "If you will allow me to clarify, as I was saying, your act has intrigued me for some time, and my proposition was that you display your talent before a small select group of my friends at a private party I am holding. If you would consider the fee of £6,000 adequate for a single performance, then I feel we may be able to discuss the matter further." The voice stopped, awaiting her reply. Dell forced a croak in. "Would you—" She coughed the frog from her throat. "Would you repeat that again? The money, that is." "Why, certainly, Miss Kane. The fee mentioned was £6,000. Obviously that is in addition to the £500 you already have." "Oh, obviously," said Dell mechanically. The figure of £6,500 seeped steadily through her fuddled brain. She frightened herself at what she would really be prepared to do for half that amount, and here was this amount offered on a plate to her, just for taking her clothes off in front of an audience, a fraction of the size of the one she stripped before every night. She clasped the phone tightly in both hands, in an effort to ensure that she kept this golden voice coming through it. "Hello, Miss Kane, are you still there?" Yes, I'm here," she rushed anxiously. "Good. All clothing, props, etc. will be supplied and paid for by myself, so may I suggest, if you're interested, we could arrange a meeting, and if you're not interested, then it will only remain for me to thank you for your time and bid you good night." "I'm interested, yes," she burst in. "Please, I'd love to perform for your friends. I accept, and, thank you for asking me. I'm grateful, honestly, very grateful, Edward." "Splendid, Miss Kane. I'm delighted at your acceptance, and I look forward to our meeting. Would it be convenient, say, if I arrive at the stage door in, shall we say, 10 minutes? "Yes, I'll be there," Dell confirmed eagerly. For this money she'd dash out there now as she was if he'd asked her. "Good. I'll be driving a white sports car, and if there happen to be any others there, mine will be the one flashing its lights when you come out. How's that?" "Yes, that will be fine, Edward," she answered softly. "Until then, goodbye, Miss Kane, and thank you again." There was a click as the receiver went down the other end. There was no time to lose now. She hurried away back to her dressing room and quickly selected the clothes she thought would be appropriate for her meeting with Edward. Yes, her ruby corduroy skirt and black sweater always made her look extremely attractive, and she did so want to make a good impression on him. If she played her cards right, who knows, she might have an opportunity for a second booking sometime, and at £6,000 a time, boy oh boy, this was the life. With a few minutes in hand, Dell trotted through the stage door into the street, her bulky handbag clutched tightly under her arm. A thin drizzle of rain made the street look more drab than usual. There were a few cars parked outside, but no white sports car. She looked anxiously up and down the street, but nothing moved. "Oh God, please let him come," she muttered. "Please don't let anything go wrong. Not now, anyway. I just wouldn't be able to cope if this fell through." She strutted nervously back and forth outside the door, religiously scanning the street like a radar beam. Fine drops of water clung to her false eyelashes. She was beginning to feel cold, damp, and very miserable. A low growl made her look down the street again, and there gliding towards her was the sleek white nose of an E-type Jaguar. As it whined nearer, the headlamps flashed like two lighthouses in unison. She strolled to the edge of the pavement, trying to look as relaxed and pleasant as possible. The passenger door swung open, and Edward's voice called out, "Do get in out of the rain, Miss Kane." She needed no prompting, but found it rather difficult to get into the car in a dignified manner. Her first sight of Edward was a clean-shaven, rather long face with a sympathetic smile, while his grey eyes absorbed the generous expanse of inner thigh as she struggled into the car. His strong white teeth flashed momentarily in the gloom. "That's one thing about an E-type," he said. "The insurance may be shocking, but it's worth it when legs like yours get in." Dell smoothed her skirt down and pulled the door shut, feeling rather embarrassed with her performance so far. But why should she? Surely he was the man she was trying to impress, and if he enjoyed the sight of her long legs, then it was a point in her favour. She had to remember that keeping him happy had to be her first objective. After all, wasn't he the golden goose? As the car purred away, she settled farther down in the seat, allowing her skirt to rumple up a few inches. "And what happens now?" she inquired. "Well, briefly, the setup is this, Miss Kane." "Oh, please call me Delarice, Edward," she implored. "Delarice it is, then," he said. "Well, I was saying, this party is for 8 of my friends, but unfortunately many of them are rather important bods. You know, the odd MP, Harley Street specialist, business tycoon, who's too keen to get his name on the birthday honours list to risk any discredit to himself, like going to a strip-tease club, etc. So I lay on a private show at my house and charge them accordingly. Which explains your generous fee, doesn't it, Delarice?" She nodded her consent, but said nothing. She merely continued to study him. Surely he was only in his early 30s. Well, definitely younger than her, anyway. Wasn't that a bit young to have such important-sounding friends? Anyway, he seemed too kind and innocent to be organising this sort of entertainment. Still, all he had said so far seemed to fit in with what had happened. It explained the secrecy and high fee. His hand dropped to the gear lever, and she waited for the fingers to slip, after the change, onto her leg in the usual accidental manner, but the hand returned smoothly to the wood-rimmed steering wheel. Well, surprise, surprise, he wasn't even trying to get any fringe benefits for the money. "The snag is, of course," continued Edward, "they must have a perfect view of you, but on no account must you see anything of them." "That's interesting," Dell remarked. "What do I do? Take everything off except a blindfold?" Edward chuckled richly deep in his throat. "Don't you worry, Delarice, that won't be necessary." Then he lowered his voice as if someone were listening behind them. "It's all done by mirrors. Damn clever, these Chinese, you know." Dell couldn't help smiling. She was beginning to take quite a liking to Edward. He was so happy and frank about everything. You just couldn't help liking him. "And what time does my act go on?" she asked. "Oh, I should say about 1:30, if that's all right with you," he said. "For that money, any time would be just right with me," she countered. Good, that's the spirit. And by the way, we've all requested an Eve in the Garden of Eden routine. I've got the setting all fixed, and your 3 fig leaves. Will that be alright? I think my artistic talent can cope with that alright, Dale answered confidently. But just out of curiosity, how many of the leaves do I have to lose on the way? Well, for that money, he started. Yes, I know, she cut in. We're going to finish with a real authentic Eve. I'm afraid so, he replied. Afraid? She asked in surprise. Really, Edward, I thought you'd be delighted. He laughed happily. Well, I am, really, he said, but I thought I'd be polite. Will there be a young Adam chasing me around the bushes? She inquired. No, I'm afraid not. And this time I'm not being polite. He turned and gave her a cheeky but warm smile. Oh well, I think I'll try and snatch a little sleep before we get there. She snuggled farther down in the upholstery. Wake me up when we're nearly there, Adam. Edward. She opened one eye to look up at him tauntingly, as he chuckled. Then she closed it, and was soon lulled to sleep by the steady throb of the engine. It felt as if she had only just closed her eyes, when she awoke suddenly, as she slid forward in the seat. Apart from the swish and creak of the 3 wiper blades on the wet screen, all was quiet. She turned quickly in the darkness and could just make out the dim silhouette of Edward's face. Are we there? She asked. Home sweet home, answered Edward, switching on the map light. The white glare made her crease up her eyes, but her curiosity at the rustling noise from Edward's direction forced them open again. Here we are, Delarice, he said, placing 3 large blue piles one after the other in her lap. I thought you'd like part of the fee before you go on, so if you'd care to check, you'll find each pile contains exactly 200 £5 notes. Will you settle for 3,000 now, and the remainder after you perform? But Dell could only nod her reply. She had been moved by the sight of £500 in her dressing room, but this was just too much to take in one go. She scooped the bulky bundles together and lifted them slowly as if they were fragile porcelain to her lips. Edward laughed at her display. Well, I've heard of the face that launched 1,000 ships, he said, but now I've seen the lips that kissed 600 fivers. But Dell ignored him. Her excitement over the money had already waned as a result of the smell. Still on the pretext of kissing the notes, she held the bundles as near her nose as possible, one after the other. All the bundles absolutely reeked of perfume, and it definitely was not hers. She lowered them a little and then tried again. There was no mistaking it. Each bundle was heavy with the same scent. She purposely avoided looking at Edward in case her face would betray her thought. Surely he didn't use perfume. She realized many men did, but somehow Edward didn't seem the type. Aftershave, etc., she could understand, but this was perfume. Ladies, for the use of. Full stop. Then it dawned on her, if Edward had been using perfume, then she would have noticed it as soon as she got into the car, and she was sure she hadn't. But wait a minute, she wasn't thinking clearly. This was obviously not Edward's money. It was what he had collected from his clients in advance for her appearance. Edward, she said suddenly, do you mind if I ask rather a personal question? Try me, he said. You know these 8 friends of yours that will be watching me tonight? Yes, what about them? Asked Edward, pressing in the cigar lighter on the dash. Well, are they... what I mean is... they're all sort of normal, are they? Edward's thick Havana cigar crackled as he rolled it between finger and thumb. Come, come, Dell. Just because they want to watch a private striptease show, that doesn't make them kinky, does it? No, no, of course not, she assured quickly, taking the notes to her lips again. They all pay, in advance, do they? If they didn't, laughed Edward, you wouldn't be holding that little lot now, believe me. No, of course not. How silly of me to ask such a thing. She tried to give a carefree laugh. Well, if you're happy with the money, I suggest we make a run for it, said Edward. The cigar lighter bobbed out a little way with a warning click to show it was ready for action. Edward sucked his cigar greedily at the glowing redness. She watched him uneasily. Happy about the money, she definitely was not, but it was no good telling him that. In her mind she was still conjuring with these 8 mysterious people. Who or what were they? That's what she wanted to know. 8 men from different walks of life, probably coming here from all parts of the country, all wealthy enough to pay about £750 in advance for a single evening's entertainment, and funnily enough, all 8 using exactly the same brand of perfume. Now that was odd. "Yes, I'm all ready," she replied. "Good," said Edward, clicking the surface of one of his fingers against his thumb. "Then let's go." Dell contorted herself out of the car, and stopping for an instant to jam tight the clasp of her bulging handbag, hurried after him. She crunched gingerly in her high-heeled shoes, along the gravel path, towards the darkened hulk of a large storm-beaten house. Long black deformed branches from the wet gnarled trees forked, accusing stumps in her direction. She shivered a little as she followed the trail of cigar smoke towards the front door. Edward was not turning out to be the gentleman he had sounded on the phone. In fact, he seemed to have lost interest in her. He had not even opened the car door for her, or helped her along the way to the house. Instead, he was just striding away in front, giving an occasional click with his fingers, leaving her to follow behind like a faithful dog. Their feet scratched up 4 wide steps, and then she waited while Edward's key grated the lock open. "In you come, my dear," he said, clicking on a few switches. "Huh, at last," she thought. "He remembers I'm still here." "Follow me," he said, closing the door. "Oh, and bring everything with you." Everything? He must be joking. Apart from the clothes she stood up in, all she had was a handbag, and she wasn't going to leave that with its precious cargo lying around where she couldn't keep an eye on it. He led the way through a brightly lit hallway into a very long dining room. The lighting here was very dim in comparison. All the lights were either encased in thick red shades, or were actually red light bulbs. Stretching down the centre of the room was a long polished table, laid in readiness for a meal of many courses from the array of cutlery. "I thought we'd have a look at the set and have a quick run through first," said Edward over his shoulder. "Then, when we're both happy with the performance, we can have a quick snack before they arrive. All right with you?" "Yes, I'd like to get everything sorted out first," she said, mechanically, while she tried to work out the number of places set at the table in the blood-red gloom. 7, 8, 9, she counted to herself. So that meant Lord Lead the Way in front would be dining here with his guests, while she would be eating elsewhere. Still, if it was imperative that she should not see their faces, then she'd have to be kept away from them for everything. It did make sense, really, she thought, but her curiosity was beginning to stir about her audience. As they left the room through another door at the end, Edward flicked off the lights. She stood there in the darkness waiting and watching the glowing tip of his cigar moving away from her. Then it seemed as if a red rocket had burst silently, shredding all its sparks around the room. This room was smaller than the other, and the red lighting was cunningly concealed over 3 of the walls, leaving the 4th completely bare and gloomy. 9 plush armchairs squatted on the thick carpet, all arranged in a neat arc, so that the occupiers would all be looking at the bare gloomy wall. Dell was beginning to feel a little like Snow White, only in her case there was 9 of everything instead of 7. At the side of the room stood a large cocktail cabinet, bedecked with a very comprehensive selection of bottles. The glasses must have been inside the cabinet, but she could imagine neat rows of 9 whisky glasses, 9 brandy glasses, and 9 of any other shaped glass that happened to be needed. She followed Edward obediently across the room to a door in the opposite glowing wall. "Careful on the steps," he warned as he went through the door and suddenly dazzled her with a burst of flickering white neon light. He stood back at the top of a flight of stone steps leading downwards. "After you, my dear," he mumbled, not bothering to remove his cigar. Dell was taken aback slightly by this sudden, unexpected display of gallantry. Her eyes were still adjusting themselves to the bright glare. She looked at him before passing. His teeth were locked together in a cold grin, as a result of gripping his cigar end and attempting an accommodating smile. It was then that she noticed the bright sheen on his face, as the neon light reflected clearly each minute droplet on his sweating face. The effect was as grotesque as a cross between a witch doctor's mask and a death mask. A patter of clicks from his fingers broke her trance, and she pushed past him to go down the steps, mainly to relieve herself of the strain of looking at him. She heard a click behind her, and then the door banged. But when she heard a bolt slide home, she stopped in her tracks and looked quickly back. But he was still there, so she hadn't been locked in the dungeons as for a fleeting second her apprehensive brain had imagined. His muffled step echoed all the way down behind her, broken only by an occasional clicking from his fingers. Maybe that's what was beginning to upset her, she thought. This habit of his of clicking when she was alone with him in this strange house, and that wet white staring face hadn't helped either. The thing was, it wasn't really hot enough to make people perspire. If anything, she could feel goose pimples on her skin, not perspiration. And if the effort of walking through a few rooms had that effect on him, then it was time he saw his doctor. When she got to the bottom of the steps, she saw a short passage ahead of her that ended with brickwork. On the left of the passage, there was a single dark green door, while on the right, with the whole length of the passage between them, were two brown steel doors. She stopped at the bottom, awaiting instructions and clutching her handbag with both hands. "Now then, Delarice," he said, "I'm sure you must be a little confused with all this, so allow me to set your mind at rest by explaining my little setup." A little of the old Edward seemed to have regained control now, but his face still looked damp and excited. His eyes switched quickly from one direction to another as he spoke, as if by doing so they could speed matters up. Delarice noticed to her personal discomfort that the excitement in his voice increased the clicking rate of his left hand. The only anchor she found to sustain herself in this bizarre situation was the heavy bundle in her hands. If it hadn't been for that, she was sure she would have made a few imprints on his face with her stiletto heel and shot out of there like a stone from a catapult. "Hey, come on, cheer up, it's not that bad, is it?" He had suddenly taken her by the shoulders and was grinning comfortingly into her face. "What? Oh no," she said, startled by his sudden move. "I'm sorry, I was miles away. I think I must be a little on the tired side." "Dear me, we can't have that," he blustered. "I must keep you fresh and happy for your performance." "Would you like to lie down for a while?" he asked. No, honestly, I'm all right. I'd much rather carry on and get it over with. That is, I mean get on with the show, of course." "Really, I'm ready, fit and able," she said as convincingly as possible under the circumstances. "Good, that's the spirit," he said, patting the sides of her arms encouragingly. "Well then, the green door there," he said, pointing, "is your changing room. You'll find everything you need. Apple and—" "Apple?" she burst in. "But of course, dear. Why, you haven't forgotten you're supposed to be Eve, have you?" "Of course, I just wasn't thinking. Yes, you were saying," she said, looking away from him to the green door. "Yes, well, apple and your free fig leaves all ready for application, so they won't fall off until you want to peel them off, eh?" He winked. "We have to keep the old eye guessing as long as we can, don't we?" She struggled a sickly half-smile in return to his comment. To keep the 18 old eyes guessing was her problem, not just one. "Now the door at the bottom of the corridor is where I've laid the set out. I'll take you in when you're ready," he said. Then, lowering his voice as if hidden ears were glued to the other side of it, he said, "And this door here is where I will be with your audience, my dear." She nodded to show that she understood. "Good, in you go then," he said, opening the green door for her. "And try to be as quick as you can, won't you? We've got a lot to get through, you know." She stepped past him without a word into the confined room, and after pressing down a stiff brass light switch, she closed the door. A weak, naked bulb shed its poor light on the wooden table and chair. Struth, this was quite a come down from the opulent air of luxury above, she thought. Anyone able to pay £6,000 a time for an act should be able to supply better amenities than these. The 3 green artificial leaves and the red apple on the table were the only splashes of colour in the room. There wasn't even a mirror or coat hanger available. She moved the props to one side of the table and plonked her handbag in the middle. She then proceeded to undress, folding all her clothes neatly and laying them on the table. She used the mirror of her powder compact to ensure she adhered her leaves properly to her body. Then, after a quick touch-up to her face, she popped it back into her handbag. One last smell of the lovely money, she thought, would be sufficient to see her through the next few hours. To her surprise, however, the strange perfume had vanished from the notes. All she could smell now was her own brand of perfume. Still, the money had been in her bag for some time now, so it was bound to be affected by its close proximity to her own make-up compounds. She closed the clasp and arranged her clothes in a covering mound of camouflage over her bag. Then, picking up the apple, which, unlike the leaves, was real, she slipped off her shoes and padded along the cold stone floor to the door. Edward was waiting for her outside. His face lit up as he admired the effect. "My word, you do look a picture, my dear," he said, his left hand giving a few clicks of approval. "This way, then," he said, leading off down the passage. Dell paused for a moment, and then before she could stop herself suddenly, blurted out, "Let's have a look in the other room first. I'm dying to see how it—" Before she could finish, Edward had spun in his tracks, and was back between her and the door, like a eunuch at a harem. "Delarice, my dear, all in good time," he soothed. "Time is pressing, you know. Now come along, we'll have a good run through your act, and when it's over, you can ramble through there to your heart's delight." Without waiting for an answer, he took her bare arm and guided her purposefully down the corridor. That clinched it as far as she was concerned. The audience was already in there and waiting. Who was he trying to kid? Run through, indeed. This was the real thing. First time. She could feel it in her bones. Her cold feet plopped along the corridor ahead of him, and after the rusty hinges had growled their protest, she went into the room where she was about to perform. The room was about 6 strides long, and about 4 strides wide. Along one of the long walls, a sincere effort had been made to create a Garden of Eden-type background. The wall had been vividly painted with leaves of varying bright greens on slender orange branches, all intertwined with an occasional splash of red and purple where the odd apple and grape bunch hung. A clear blue sky reflected the glare of the numerous strong arc lights set at strategic positions on the other 3 walls. In the floor near the centre of the picture was a small pool of real water, large enough probably for 2 frogs to encircle each other without actually touching. Around the pool and over parts of the floor lay patches of green artificial grass carpet, but the oddest construction was that of a thick twisted hardboard tree trunk arranged about a foot away from the painted wall. Not that the actual effect of the tree was odd. In fact, if anything, it blended very realistically with the background. But odd because of the support behind it. The tree was attached to round solid steel girders, which obviously had their foundations deep down in the concrete floor. The only girder that was not set in this way was the one that branched off and disappeared into the pool of water. Even this piece of metal had been skillfully hidden from the front by one of the painted hardboard roots of the tree. Delarice now turned her gaze to the opposite wall. The contrast was staggering. Apart from the fitted spot lamps, all it could boast of was a single mirror running from floor to ceiling, about 3 feet wide, positioned directly opposite the hardboard tree. Regardless of the impression everything in the room had made on her, the only thing she said was, "I suppose that's a 2-way mirror." "It is indeed, Delarice," said Edward, walking over to it and giving one patch a gentle wipe with his handkerchief. "As I told you," he continued, "my guests will be able to see you, but alas, you won't be able to see them. Neat, isn't it?" "Oh, very," she answered without enthusiasm. "Well, if 9 people were going to watch her through that, then they'd have to sit on each other's shoulders if they all wanted to see." "I'd like to see how they all manage it," she said sarcastically. Believe me, my dear, he answered, each one will be sitting in comfort, with as good a view as any of the others. They must be very skinny devils as well as rich, said Delarice straight at the mirror, hoping anybody on the other side could hear her as well as see her. All this gadgetry had made her take a greater dislike to this audience than any of the others she had worked in front of. It was as she was doing this that she saw the patch of blackened concrete behind her. "What's that?" she asked, turning and pointing to the floor. "Oh, that," said Edward, dragging a piece of artificial grass across a little with his heel to cover it. "I had a little accident when I was painting the scene. A tin of paint tipped and caught fire. It must have been quite a blaze to char so much of the floor. Yes," he tried to laugh light-heartedly. "It gave me quite an experience, I can tell you." Then, as if wishing to change the subject, he suddenly took the apple from her hand. "Now, I think I'll be able to talk to you through my intercom, dear. So I think we'll leave the apple here for now," he said, placing the apple in the grassy patch, positioned precisely over the marked floor. "So just do as I tell you and leave the apple where it is until I give you the okay. Right now, any questions before I leave you to it?" he asked, backing towards the door. A rising sense of panic in Dell's mind thrust numerous suspicions forward for her to ask for clarification. But through the sudden turmoil, all that came out was, "Will my money be safe where it is, or had I better—" "Safe? Of course it will be safe, my dear," he cut in. "Now relax. In a little while you're going to be a very wealthy girl, you know. Now just forget everything and give me the performance of your life, eh?" He smiled encouragingly at her, and with a last click of the fingers he had gone, clanging the door to. If it hadn't been for the presence of that ominous mirror she would have rushed across to try the door, but deep down she knew it was well and truly locked from the outside. To hell with it, she thought. They can think what they like behind there. I'm making sure. She walked rather self-consciously to the door and tried the steel handle. As she thought, locked. Maybe he had a good reason for it, but how she wished she knew what it was. "Testing, testing. Can you hear me?" She jumped slightly as his voice suddenly crackled all through her actin cell. "Just nod if you can hear me, please, Delarice." She nodded obediently to the mirror. "Good now. Cheer up, dear, you must force a little smile. You know we mustn't frighten our customers away with those old frowns, must we?" His voice continued as if it were coaxing a 6-year-old child. "Now why don't we walk back and forth across the set a few times to get the feel of it, eh?" Dell marched flat-footed to one end, then back to the tree, thinking how pathetic she must have looked to anyone watching. She gave a wide smile in the direction of the mirror, to assure him that his prescription had had the desired effect. "Much better," he crooned. "Now let's keep it like that and they won't know what's hit them." "Boy, I'd like to hit them with more than just a smile," she rambled to herself, the pack of scented creeps that they are. "I bet it smells like a women's hairdresser in there." Then a sudden thought struck her. Maybe they were women, all 8 of them. That would explain the smell on the notes better than any of her other deductions. Why hadn't she thought of it before? But what sort of women would pay for this type of party? Her brain began to feel sick at this sudden development. Oh God, what had she allowed herself to get mixed up in now? "Ah, shrilled the voice. "We're beginning to go again, aren't we? Now come along, Delarice, smile, dear, that's it. Better, better. A bit more now, good. Now there won't be any music for the trial run because it will interfere with my talking to you. But I'm sure a professional artist like yourself will be able to cope, eh?" She nodded at the mirror. "Good, that's a spirit. Okay, let's go. Now we'll start from behind the tree. Come on, chop chop, off you go. Right. Now emerge slowly, head first. Good, that's it. No, not too fast. Slowly. Lovely. Keep it like that. Smile. Smile. Don't forget, that's it. Now let's come out gracefully. You're the first woman on earth, remember? Good. Smile, please, dear. Do try to remember. Shoulders back. Come on, fill those lungs. Let me see those leaves straining. Oh, yes, yes, yes. And smile, beautiful, keep coming like that. Dell exhaled a short gasp of air from her full lungs. He did rabbit on a bit. She'd be glad when the real thing came so that she only had the music to contend with. Still, it was his show really, so she was perfectly happy to move around as directed. This was far less energetic so far than her usual number. Smile, please. There it was again. At this rate, her jaws might set solid in a smiling position. Good, good. Now move a little nearer to me. She moved a few slow steps towards the mirror. Enough. Stay there. Good. Now bring those hands into action slowly now. Move them up to your thighs, slowly. Now away. Come on. Sway your body. That's it. Perfect. Relax. Leave the smile go for a minute. Keep moving those hands up, slowly now. Keep swaying. Now bring your hands under your breasts. That's it. You want to be free now. Now free yourself. Rip away those leaves. Rip. Rip. Ah yes. Now just sway. The voice had diminished to a mere whisper. Your arms are heavy. Let them sag to your sides. Keep swaying. Oh, perfect, Delarice. Just keep that movement. Sway for me, dear. Sway. Now gently, ever so gently, try a few slow half-turns from side to side. Dell let the two leaves flutter to the floor from her hanging hands, and turned slightly first to the right, then to the left, giving the mirror every opportunity to see her from every angle. There was a sharp click and the sound of a few gurgling bubbles behind her. She was about to turn to look when the voice rasped sharply. Head, Delarice. Keep the head still. That's it. Smile, please. Good. Now start moving back, dear. Keep looking this way. That's it. Now pick up your apple. Not too quickly now. She stepped forward for the apple and picked it up with her right hand. Hold that angle, Delarice. Don't come up yet. Oh, you look wonderful, dear. Slowly now, up slowly. Despite the rattle of the voice, she still sensed a steady rippling noise from the pool behind her, but the reflection of her body in the mirror obstructed her view of the back, so to see she would have to turn around, and that would send Edward spare for a bet. Farther back now, that's it. The tree's just behind you. She could hear the steel creaking as she came to it. You're there now. Lean back and relax. Now keep the apple in your right hand. Now slowly take a large bite. Go on now. Dell studied the apple suspiciously for a second. It looked like any other rosy-eating apple. She sank her teeth deep through the skin, spraying the roof of her mouth with the rich juice. Now slowly and deliberately move your left hand to your last leaf. Ah well, this was it. This is what they had all been waiting for. She gripped the leaf ready with her hand. The tree creaked heavily behind her. I'll have to slim a bit of this weight off, she thought, or those girders aren't as solid as they looked. Slowly peel away. Edward's voice was a hushed whisper. That's it, slowly, yes. Right, let the leaf fall now. That's it, smile, you're free. Smile, please. Delarice, another bite, go on, lean back as much as you like and bite. Good, good. Now stretch that apple high for all to see. That's it. Stretch that arm up. Lean it back against the tree. Good. Keep it there. This is perfect, my dear. Stay there. Still now. Don't move. Keep it like that. Very still now. Dell tried to eat the bits of apple without making it too obvious. She hoped that this was about the end now, and that he wouldn't want her to take any more bites, because her mouth was choked with lumps of half-chewed apple. Just then, a woolen scarf seemed to slip across the wrist holding the apple. She automatically flexed her arm to free her wrist from the sudden sensation. To her amazement, she could not move it. She forgot all about the voice and her own nudity, and twisted her head up sharply to see what held her wrist. To her horror, she saw a thick, dark, patterned, slithering mass knotted around her slender arm. The apple dropped as her hand opened and her fingers stiffened. A shower of apple bits sprayed suddenly from her mouth, as her scream ricocheted around the room. She tugged away as hard as she could from the obnoxious body, but to no avail. A large head wavered around the edge of the tree and transfixed her with two bright, beady eyes. A long, slender, forked tongue flicked silently in and out a few times before the ugly, cavernous mouth stretched wide above her, displaying 2 rows of great white pointed teeth. Her second piercing scream had just rent the air, when the head sprang towards her left shoulder. The sharp teeth plunged into her flesh with such force that her knees buckled completely beneath her. The huge jaws compressed the teeth deeper as the anaconda consolidated its grip. Slowly and deliberately, the thick brown coils looped out from behind the tree and slid methodically around her smooth, trembling body. First her legs were locked together, then her right hand was freed, but despite her desperate effort to clutch hard with both hands at one of the enormous living coils, the quivering roundness continued to slither unimpeded on its mission. She had no strength to spare now for screaming. All her might was being used to withstand the crushing pain in her shoulder and the general tightening around her. By now her arms had been forced into submission and were pinned to her body. All around her the coils continued their encircling until even her breast had been encased in the wriggling shroud. Now that the body had been securely entwined, the anaconda relaxed its gripping jaws and swayed its head back as if to study its prey. Dell was having great difficulty in breathing now, as she gaped in stunned silence at the flicking tongue. Only her head was free from the spiral vice. Her brain was still reeling from the sudden shock of the attack, yet she was vaguely aware of the voice hissing out through the intercom. "And the Lord God said unto the serpent, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed." But these words were short-lived in her brain. The anaconda was already beginning to constrict her body in earnest. The pressure on her chest was now unbearable. Her gaping mouth gasped snatches of air to her tortured lungs. A sharp crack stung her head with a fresh wave of pain as one of her ribs splintered. Her breathing was now painful and erratic, interspersed with sudden coughs and splutters. A spark of fire seemed to shoot up her back, and then she realized that she could no longer feel any pain in her legs. That could only mean one thing, that her spine had snapped beneath the pressure. For one brief instant, the thought of her money flashed into her head. Now how pointless that impressive amount seemed. And as if her imminent death helped her to see things more clearly, she thought of how the smell of the money had confused her, just as probably the smell of her perfume on it would confuse the next girl to be lured along to this strange stage of terror and death. Another series of sharp cracks sent spurts of bright red blood spluttering with her choking coughs. Her protruding, dying eyes didn't even blink as the snake bathed a flow of slippery saliva over them and other parts of her head, in readiness to assist the swallowing process. Its expanded jaws were already working smoothly down, engulfing her head as her last gurgle of air bubbled fitfully through a mouthful of warm blood. The anaconda had now reduced her body to the shape of an elongated sausage. It toppled its prey to the ground, and using its own tail as a lever, proceeded to push her farther into its yawning mouth. Edward watched fascinated through the viewing lens of his humming movie camera. He had a green eye shade on his forehead, and he puffed away excitedly at his cigar. He didn't know how long it would take the anaconda to swallow the pink pulp, but he would keep filming until he came to the end of his film anyway. Then he would soon have another great epic in the can. At least this time he wouldn't have to dispose of pieces of charred body, as he had last week, thanks to the strong digestive juices in the anaconda, which were capable of digesting bones and even shells. Still, last week's film, which he was going to call The Nudist Joan of Arc, was a real gem as well, even if the fire had made a bit of a mess on his studio floor. His close circle of wealthy friends were really going to enjoy these films when he showed them in his theatre upstairs. The beauty of it was, of course, that unlike a single live performance, he could show the films as often as he liked and make money each time without having to pay any artist for doing the job. He let the camera run on its own while he sat back exhausted in his special chair. Like all the famous directors of Hollywood, he had his own canvas deck chair with his name, Edward Hitchcock, in bold black print on the back. He mused happily how amazed his friends always were at his special expensive film shows, and how they kept beseeching him to tell them how he arranged the trick photography. These days the ordinary public always flocked to the cinema if there was an Alfred Hitchcock film showing, but in time he was sure the name of Edward Hitchcock would displace the well-known master of suspense, and everyone would be praising his fantastic works of suspense and realistic horror. The amusing thing was, it was also terribly simple to achieve really. Anyone could do it. Well, anyone as cunningly clever as he was anyway. The anaconda was still swallowing its crushed meal. Already its skin was expanding to surmount its newly acquired bulk. He picked up his pad of notes from the empty chair alongside his. He ran his eyes down the long list of detailed notes, each with their neatly underlined subheading. Set, lighting, props. Here was what he wanted. Anaconda details. Now, according to his information, the snake would take approximately 2.5 hours to swallow her, then about 22 hours to consume the meal. He clicked his fingers meditatively, as he worked the arithmetic out in his head. That meant about this time tomorrow, the anaconda would slither back, contented, into the hidden tank beneath the pool, and he would be able to release the lever to close the hatch on it. Yes, that seemed all right. Then he would be able to get into the studio and start working on his next set. He already had the drums of concentrated acid ready to pump into the tank after draining the water away, and that would remove all traces of the anaconda, which in turn would have removed all traces of Delarice. He blew a blue cloud of smoke into the air. This had definitely been his best planned and best executed project so far. But enough of this gloating. If he was to surpass the great Alfred Hitchcock, then it was time to start thinking about his next great production. He closed his eyes to shut out the squirming tangle through the mirror. He couldn't do justice to his planning and watch that spectacle at the same time. Now what about the story of Lady Godiva? That was always popular, and he was sure that his creative genius could devise a fitting end for her. After all, it hadn't failed him yet.